Mnet have got survival shows down to an art, or more like a science since I don't find them very artistic. And every survival show, especially if done by Mnet, like a science, has a formula that it follows and characters it must include. We have the angel of the show, the villain, the selfish one and the selfless one, the best dancer and the best rapper, the person who struggles with language barriers, the main vocalist, the mother of the group, the crazy one, the funny one, the one with tons of duality, the lazy one, the person who starts at number 1 and then gets torn down, and similarly, the Avengers group. All of these archetypes can be applied to multiple people at once, and one person can have multiple at once too. But these are characteristics that we see highlighted again and again. And although I think I've highlighted most of them, there is one glaring hole in my list. You may or may not have noticed it, but it's another survival show staple. It's appeared on almost every single show I've seen. In fact, it has appeared on every single show I've seen, and considering how much drama it easily creates, I would be surprised if there was a single show that has ever not used it. And that's the archetype of the skilled and experienced trainee who is now on their last chance for debut. In Season 1, Girls Planet, we saw this story tacked onto people like Doa, Bora, Uchi, Chaeyeon, Mashiro, and most notably, Yujin. And in Season 2, it made its very expected return, attaching itself to trainees like Hwanhee and Keita. But it also interestingly attached itself to someone else, someone who no one expected to be on the show. A few months before Boys Planet aired, news media started reporting like crazy, revealing that it was indeed a pseudo last chance for one unexpected character, Pentagon's leader Hui, fresh out of the military. Needless to say, it shocked a lot of people. Hui may not have made it into Zero Base 1, but I want to discuss him and his editing on the show, separate from the editing of the show itself, because I felt that it was just weird to say the least. Mnet seemed intent on both discrediting him as an artist and capitalizing off the fame he brought to the show, and it resulted in some very weird moments. I genuinely think he was one of the most interesting characters on the show, up there with Ganuk, Junghao, Ricky, Matthew, and Hanbin. Hey, that's just Tomboy Team plus the Zero Base 1 foreigners. In this video, I'll give a quick background on Hui and his time on Boys Planet. In this video, I'll give a quick background on Hui and his time on Boys Planet, and then we'll discuss how he was edited in the show. Then I'll discuss in more detail how this editing would have affected him and his image, including some opinions from general viewers and fans on how it affected them. At the end, we'll consider the implications of Boys Planet and his inability to re-debut in Zero Base 1 on his career and the career of Pentagon. I really wanted to make this mini-sode turned episode because I found his editing on the show just insanely weird. Probably stemming from Mnet's almost conflicting emotions of liking Hui but not wanting him in the final group. His editing often took me out of the show and completely broke my suspension of disbelief. And I think he has one of the most interesting and unique arcs, or not really arcs, on the show, so I wanted to discuss it. Interestingly, the only person who has had a similar survival show arc that I can think of is Fuko on Island 2, who Mnet also respected and wanted to stick around for a while, but didn't actually want in the final group. Both were more experienced and skilled to the point of kind of being above the competition. They were both highlighted for vocals, had great leadership skills, and were kept around right until the finale where they were disposed of, along with the odd editing which led them up to that point. And both of them, oddly, had their fans actively choose not to vote for them. Hui because his fans didn't actually want him in the final group, and Fuko because her fans were more desperate for others to debut than her. And I had a surprising amount to say about Hui's editing, hence why this ended up becoming an unexpected episode instead of a mini-sode. Will I ever be able to make a mini-sode that's actually mini? Goodness knows. Don't worry, Girls Planet viewers, that episode is still in the running and it will appear eventually. But for now, let's talk about Hui, and next time about Kepler's terrible storyline. So with that little tangent, let's get into it, with the disclaimer that I am only a casual Pentagon listener, so please forgive me if some of the specific details are presented poorly. Also, please accept my apologies for the bad phoned footage of Boys Planet which may need to be used, since Vicky doesn't work with screen recording. Hui, or Lee Ho-tek, was born on August 28, 1993. He joined JYP in around 2010 and had an odd stint in his life where he was involved in the show Chinese Idol, the Chinese version of the British show Pop Idol, but he didn't make it through. In around 2013, he joined Cube and during his pre-debut period was involved in various other projects, as many trainees are. He debuted with Pentagon in October 2016 as their leader who also dabbled in composition and production, the group having been formed through, coincidentally, an Mnet reality show, Pentagon Maker. He later joined the infamous project group Triple H with female artist and soloist Hyuna and his groupmate Dawn, making him an awkward third wheel in their at-the-time secret relationship. Hui was later involved in composing music for the second season of Produce, and its resulting boy group 101, making his eventual appearance in Boys Planet even more depressing to many fans. In 2018, Pentagon reached what is generally accepted to be the height of their popularity with their song Shine, a song which became so popular with the general public that the promotion period had to be extended. Shine remains to this day a very well-known song, and in the words of trainees on Boys Planet, is a must-know for Idol trainees to dance to. It is arguably their single biggest hit and the single song they are known for, and despite oddly not receiving any music show wins, was supposed to propel Pentagon to stardom. Unfortunately, a few months later, Dawn left the group after his relationship with Hyuna was revealed. I have no way of verifying this, but I hear that at the time, Dawn kind of represented the vibe of the group, and was the star of songs like Shine, so many people feel that him leaving had a big effect on the group. In 2019, Pentagon held their first world tour, and in 2020 they joined another Mnet reality show, Road to Kingdom, where they finished third place overall, and made a pretty good impression in my opinion. However, this was when metaphorical disaster struck. Time always moves on, and eventually it gets every boy group with one looming threat: mandatory military service. After Kingdom, Pentagon's members, starting with the eldest Jinho, had to start to enlist, and any boy group fan knows that military service often means stagnation for a group, and can even lead to their downfall. Let me give you a well-known example. EXO were super popular before they did their military service, but the stagnation of that service, and other issues that came with it, like lawsuits with their company, meant that even though all of the members are now out of the military, I feel like I haven't heard a peep out of them since like 2019, 2020. They were supposed to be BTS's biggest rivals, but they just kind of disappeared, and the fact that BTS's delayed service meant that they had more time to promote has definitely contributed to the sudden divide in popularity between the two groups. Anyway, now that I've expressed to you the kind of doom that comes with military service, you can hopefully understand that even though they released songs during this period, and even though they got their first win with Daisy, Pentagon wouldn't be able to reach their full potential. And unfortunately, as each of the members went to the military and that time ticked on, their contract renewal and even more doom approached. Hui enlisted in January 2021, and some of the music he worked on was released over this period by the group and by other members. During his military time, and a good chunk of Pentagon's career as a whole, Pentagon have had very sporadic success, alternating between albums charting between 3rd and 10th, 1st and not at all, with seemingly no pattern. Reading their chart history on Wikipedia or on any other site is very confusing, although I can say one really good thing. Their most recent albums in 2021 and 2022 have significantly more sales than their first few albums. I mean, like 5 times the sales or more. And as much as I have doubts for the group in the future, it is nice to see that they're more successful than at debut. One of their more recent Korean albums, Invite You, released in January 2022 while he was in the military, sold just over 100,000 copies in Korea, which isn't at all shabby. Unfortunately, other than one mini album that didn't really make a splash, they haven't released anything since. Let's get into why. In February of 2023, Hui was announced to be participating on the show Boys Planet, only 4 months after his release from the military. In fact, we learned on the show that he auditioned for the show only a few days after his discharge. This sparked huge discussion online, as many people were shocked that he would make this move. A move that debut idols only make if it is seriously their last chance. Others were shocked that he was a contestant as opposed to a judge, and his involvement in the show led to heightened concern for Pentagon, who hadn't been particularly active recently. I'll get into the details of Hui's involvement on the show in the next segment, but we basically found out that after Shine, the group had been getting less and less recognition and less offers to promote themselves, and that it had been making them, especially Hui, feel down and unwanted. He expressed that he felt the show was something he needed to keep performing as an idol and wanted to put Pentagon back on the map. We'll come back to his specific sentiments about Pentagon later. Hui ended up placing 13th on Boys Planet, although I do want to specify that, interestingly, he was more than capable of making the final lineup with his fanbase. Hui's case involves possibly the only case in survival show history where a contestant's fans have made the active choice to not vote their pick into the group. And I do mean it was a very active choice. They didn't want him in. After the show came the doomed Pentagon contract renewals, and it really was kind of doomed. 5 members, Yoon, Yanan, Yuto, Kino, and Woo-seok, didn't renew their contracts, and later Hong-seok cancelled his contract with Cube. This, combined with member Shimwon entering the military, means that Pentagon currently consists of only 2 members, Hui and Jino. Yeah, even though Cube said the group wasn't disbanding, I can't be the only one who thinks this doesn't bode well for them. Hui released his debut solo album Who Is Me Complex in January 2024, including collaborations with other Pentagon members. I'm not entirely sure what he's up to right now, but it probably has something to do with music production, seeking collaborations for Pentagon separate from Cube's terrible management, and generally trying to keep both his career and those of his group mates alive. I feel sorry for the guy in terms of his group, but thankfully for both me and Hui, he has the production skills he needs to succeed. Hui has been involved in a lot of stuff, and I mean a lot of stuff. He's done musicals, acting, MCing, has produced for multiple groups, has been involved in a whopping 6 Mnet survival shows, and many more for other companies, and has done countless collaborations and produced countless songs for groups and shows alike. If there is one thing that's good about this whole situation, it's that I know that Hui will always have a job, even if that job isn't being an idol. He has a very impressive and a very stacked resume. So now, with that rough history of Hui out of the way, let's discuss how he was edited on Boys Planet. Weirdly, that's how. In episode 1 and to a lesser extent throughout the whole show, Hui is introduced in a similar way to Yoojin was on Girls Planet. The other contestants are both horrified and awed to see someone whose skills are just so much incredibly higher than theirs. Both got a sob story about how horrible Cube is and how this is their last chance. At this point, Mnet would have known 2 things. First, that fans would expect Hui to be treated in a similar way to Yoojin on Season 1, aka to get views, and with their performances held to the very end to build hype. But they must have also known that this could be repetitive, and thus they would have to change it up. Luckily for Mnet, Eugen and Hui are different people with different personalities. Wow, who would have guessed? And since Hui didn't act like a carbon copy of Eugen, they were able to edit him differently. And let's be honest, Hui was guaranteed to not make the cut for Zero Base 1, precisely because of how he acted differently from Eugen. And he was guaranteed to not make it in from episode 1, or you could even say from the moment he was announced for the show. There were tons of reasons she made it in and he didn't, but I would say the main one is this small moment in episode 2 of both shows. Around 40 minutes into episode 2 of both shows, because Mnet's formula is so good that the exact same events happen at the exact same time, even across seasons. In episode 2 of Girls Planet, Eugen talks about how CLC have been left behind, and basically disbanded behind closed doors. She explicitly mentions how the group is over and says that she never felt like she fit the group's concept, basically saying both implicitly and explicitly that there is no chance of CLC coming back, and even perhaps that she doesn't want to go back, or at least she doesn't want to go back to that performance concept. On the other hand, Hui doesn't mention that Pentagon have disbanded, because of course they hadn't, and there was still some hope that they could come back. He talks instead about how they're being given less and less attention and how more people are rejecting work with them. Instead of distancing himself from the group like Eugen does, he talks about how he wants to help the members and the group. The implication for many fans being that he wants to help put Pentagon back on the map, and thus make their next comeback more successful. This is probably the single biggest reason that Eugen made it into Kepler and Hui didn't make it into Zero Base 1. Eugen had no group to return to, and her fans desperately wanted to see her continue as an idol. But Hui did have a group to return to, and he was pretty important to said group, no matter how poor their chances were and are. Anyway, back to episode 1. Hui is introduced and everyone is super shocked. It's the biggest reveal ever, even though the audience themselves already know that he's involved. As expected, his performance is only teased at the end of the episode. We need to wait for episode 2 to see it and his backstory, where, of course, he is the last trainee shown. His introduction in episode 1 is where the start of his too talented for this show edit comes in. Other trainees are shocked that he isn't a Star Master, and they're shocked into instant submission by his singing skills. Despite this, we do get to see another element of Hui on this show. He is incredibly humble and down to earth. Despite being an incredibly experienced idol, he talks casually behind the scenes to Doa and teases him. Next comes Mnet's secret plan, a group of poorly prepared trainees performing Pentagon's Shine. This was probably intended in a similar, although less controversial way, to Helicopter from Season 1. By showing Pentagon's most popular song, performed by earnest, naive, and inexperienced trainees, Mnet practically guarantees some kind of response from Hui, whether that be anger, criticism, teasing, or sadness, and any of these reactions they can edit to create drama. In the end, he cried, which let Mnet nicely edit their favourite way to portray Hui, as a depressed old man past his prime. As sad as it was to see, I found it kind of hilarious that Mnet edited Hui like a depressed and useless grandpa desperately clinging to the old days, when he really isn't that old even for K-pop, and when his skills certainly haven't degraded. I also don't think he was particularly depressed about Pentagon. Sure, he was sad, but he also looked forward to the future, and he took matters into his own capable hands. They made him seem ancient and trash when he really wasn't, but we'll discuss more of that later. Anyway, for now we get the odd contrast of even a bad performance making him sad, and the poignant moment of Jongwoo being the first to notice. The contrast between the joyful energy of Shine and Hui's crying is also notable. The other trainees saying that his crying breaks their heart is a prime way Mnet portrayed him as a sad old man, by showing how even those who should have been below him pity him. At the same time though, we do see that he's a role model. The other trainees talk about how they learnt Shine, and they are all very respectful of him, and seemingly deeply moved by his sadness. This Shine performance allows Mnet to nicely lead into the teaser for Hui's performance, where he is, of course, shown as the final boss of the show, and as someone who even has directed other idols and rearranged the song he was given to perform. His 10 years of experience, double digits, wow, is emphasized repeatedly, reinforcing both his skill level and his age. Despite this, Hui is wonderfully humble and encourages the other trainees to see him as an equal, before we move into the teaser, which, like with Eugen in Season 1, makes us worried that he might have stuffed up his performance, although of course he won't. In Episode 2, we can already see the start of Hui's Boys Planet journey, making friends with and becoming a mentor for every trainee under the sun. In the reaction segment, he is cuddly with Hanbin in particular a lot. His performance is, of course, held until the end, where he gets the backstory I previously mentioned, of being fresh out of the military and trying to save his group. He does mention here that Boys Planet is his only, read last, chance. But since this is edited in to be after he talks about basically wanting to put Pentagon back on the map, we, the audience, get the impression that it's his last chance to gain fame for the group, as opposed to his last chance to be an idol himself. To reinforce how he outskills the other contestants, the judges explicitly mention they'll follow his wishes and judge him objectively, so they see him as an equal because he is career-wise. Shutdown is framed as a super hard song to perform, and since Hui seems confident, we are prepared for him to kill it, which he obviously does, vocally at least. Odd judge reactions during the dance break are bound to make his fans nervous, and kickstarts Mnet's agenda that Hui is a terrible dancer. He gets an unsurprising standing ovation, and the fact that Zhang Hao says the judges shouldn't even need to discuss his star level reinforces the skill of the performance. This is where we start getting weird things. The audience gets sudden anxiety as the judges actually decide they need to discuss his star level, but this is solved when he gets 4 stars anyway. I found the feedback for this really interesting. Mnet highlights that his dance skills aren't up to par. Understandable since he's a 3rd-gen idol fresh out of the military, but they include the judges saying that he was so good that he could cover his weaknesses with his strengths, and that he even knew his weaknesses himself. This is, in my opinion, pretty much the highest compliment they could have given him, and shows that both Mnet and the judges had pretty high respect for Hui. Just think about it. Not only was he fully aware of his faults, showing his self-awareness, humble attitude, and idol experience, but he was also able to use his vocal skills to make up for his dance skills, showing again his insane levels of skill, self-awareness, and experience. And this is all reinforced by his humble joy and surprise at getting 4 stars. I think this scene is the one that really nicely summarized Mnet's attitude towards Hui. They liked him and respected him as an artist, and they were prepared to show his skills to appease his fans, create drama, and keep people watching whatever they wanted for each episode. But they always manipulated the editing so his fans would be kept waiting until the end. And as much as they liked what he could bring to the table, they didn't want him in the final group. So they picked a few, quote, faults to highlight and ran with them. He was too quiet and too non-confrontational to cause drama. He was a poorer dancer and his performance skills compared to 5th gen standards were lacking. And he was old and depressed. Yep. Now, I have to say that I do think Hui's dance skills are good, as are his performance skills. Mnet edited them to be so much worse than they actually were. But nonetheless, I do think he was in the unfortunate situation of being a 3rd-gen idol in a 5th-gen world. Anyway, then we get onto the signal song test, where a judge awkwardly asks why Hui is missing dance beats when he's a great singer. I say awkwardly because 1, singing and dancing are different skills, And 2, the show has literally said Hui is bad at dance, and then it suddenly expects him to suddenly be good at dance? Very odd. A lot of my notes about their criticism of his dancing were just, duh lol, because the show said he was bad and then they act surprised when he made mistakes. This is odd editing by definition, but it does make sense, because the act of being surprised makes it more dramatic to see Hui fail. We get lots of tense zooms and music and many highlights of Hui's mistakes and his own shame at them. Even his vocals managed to be criticised, as the judges say that he sang in harmony with the song, something they weren't supposed to do. Honestly, I took this as another sign of him just being too good. He's so good at being in harmony that he automatically did it. One of his fans said to me here that they're not surprised he did poorly, since at the time they probably filmed this, Pentagon were in and out of Japan for the Asia Artist Awards. And this is true, they performed there, and it probably would have affected his time on Boys Planet, but this wasn't when they filmed the test. That would have been in late November probably, several weeks before the award show. But even then, Hui would have been preparing for that award show and getting back in the idol groove. So the point that he would have had less time to train for this mission than others is definitely true. Either way, Mnet wasn't going to let Hui have any excuses. They never let anyone on any of these shows have excuses. It doesn't matter if someone's mum died or if they themselves almost died. You missed that high note? You automatically suck. On the bright side, I don't think this segment convinced any of Hui's actual fans that he was a bad performer and dancer. Although, unfortunately, it would have convinced at least some of his non-fans. This segment also gives us an amazing highlight of Hui's great attitude on the show. Instead of being stuck up, he is humble and recognises that he can learn from these younger and less experienced trainees. He shows a desire to learn and improve specifically through asking others for help. But even this makes the other trainees sad, making him feel, yet again, like a desperate old man, lowered to asking the plebs for help. In episode 3, we get to see more of Hui being friends with everyone, being generally down to earth and doing generally goofy things, which show that he has a sense of humour and that he is able to adjust his attitude to get along with tons of people. This is primarily shown through him getting involved in workouts with Doa and co. He's the emotional support for many trainees, but also potentially needs emotional support, as he has to face the bitter truth that he is now a trainee on a show where Minhyun, someone he was once considered more senior to and wrote songs for, is now an MC. The show kind of shows this gap between them, or at least implies it, but let's be honest, they were probably buddies behind the scenes and were just told to be distant on camera. In the K versus G test, Hui is ranked first by audience views, unsurprisingly. And yet, also unsurprisingly, he is still humble about it. Also unsurprisingly, everyone wants to be his teammate, showing him as a strong and desirable trainee and leader. In even more unsurprising events, Hui picks Hanbin to be his first teammate, and although I do find this comment that he'll just pick the whole first row fun, and it would have been interesting, unsurprisingly, Hui is more prepared than that. His other teammates are Yeram, Donghyun, Songmin, Sobin, and Gyuvin. Mnet shows Hui here partially deferring to other trainees like Hanbin, asking their opinions on his member choices and so on. This is good for both Hanbin and Hui. It shows that they get along and that Hui is humble, and also that Hanbin is respected by one of the most skilled contestants on the show. And, of course, everyone is shocked and awed by how amazing Hui's team is. Showing yet more in the way of humbleness and leadership, Hui has his team democratically vote for the song they want to do, even though he planned for them to be super strong for Love Me Right. He even has his positions planned, showing how strategic he's been about this whole thing and his experience in the industry. The only boast, as such, that Hui takes is taking both the leader and main vocal positions, although, to be fair to him and the other trainees, he was the best person for both parts. And that's exactly why he was both main vocal and leader for every single mission. This is where 1. Mnet get to reveal the fact that Hui is different from Yujin, and 2, Mnet get very lucky with Hui being different from Yujin, and they use this to their advantage in the edit. Even though there were hints of Hui's weird editing in the first 2 episodes, this is where it really starts, and is basically the crux of Hui's weird editing. On Girls' Planet, Yujin was pretty timid and demure. She did try to stretch herself, but she wasn't particularly daring or outspoken, other than in Shoot, where she took both the main vocal and leader positions. Hui, on the other hand, being a producer, is daring when it comes to music, and decides to innovate, hence his extremely high note in Love Me Right. In addition, he gets sick around this time, and even better, his main vocal opposition is Jay, who showed a great vocal performance in the demo round. So Mnet now has one of the best vocalists in the show going up against Hui, who is known for his vocals. Hui is sick and he has experimented. Mnet knows they can edit him badly with that, and they know they can use that to 1, make him seem less skilled than he is, 2, make him seem like he's breaking down and insecure, and 3, make us wonder whether Jay might actually be able to beat him, creating drama. For Mnet, this is a have your cake and eat it too situation. They can make him look bad, but Hui will almost certainly still give a good final performance. And they can create drama in the battle of the main vocals, but because their on-site audience is made up of Pentagon fans who may or may not also be racist towards Chinese people, Hui will still win the battle and his fans will still be appeased. So many people, both fans of Hui and not, have pointed out how ridiculous it is that Mnet even tried to convince us that Hui had the slightest chance of losing to Jay, especially considering the fans were the ones voting. And yet they did it anyway, and they managed to create drama and stress Hui fans out, unfortunately. And they somehow managed to convince some people that he was super insecure and just hiding behind his vocals, making him look bad since, according to Mnet, he's so insecure that he'll fall apart the moment someone is even close to as good vocally as he is. As with all Mnet shows, the way they create this appearance is by showing lots of shots of Hui looking nervous, with lots of zooms and sound effects. He gets tons of reaction shots during the G group performance, making us think that he's super nervous about Jay's performance. Anyway, as with the past round, Hui's performance is used, not in full, but to tease the next episode, and we see the judges being worried about him, which reinforces our idea that they respect him as a performer, just not as a future Zero Base One member, and that he could still make mistakes. In episode 4, we see a lot of people coming to Hui for advice, especially leadership advice, of course. We see again how humble Hui is and how good his leadership skills are, as he delegates dance management to Hanbin instead of himself and follows Hanbin's instructions well. He leads his group well through the position changes and so on. The judges mention many times throughout the show how Hui sings in a female range, which I personally think is a bit of an odd thing to emphasize, and the lack of editing around these statements makes us wonder about their inclusion. Was it to show his vocal skill or to try and emasculate him? It's combined with Hui being very stubborn about his high notes, so it could be to try and make him look bad. The fact that I even have to think about this shows how weird the editing is, because Mnet editing usually is, and should be, very clear and black and white. Your audience should not be thinking. But here it isn't, perhaps reflecting their mixed feelings about Hui. We see more of Hui being humble as he says that Jay is perfect for Love Me Right, and as he takes the judges' feedback and his own condition into account and does a less ridiculous high note. Of course, the fans love him, and so do the judges, and of course Mnet, who knew that he wouldn't disappoint them. The fact that the judges say this and emphasize that this is only the first mission and his team is already going so hard shows yet again how Hui is just so out of this show's league. Unsurprisingly, the judges highlight Hui's experience as a producer, basically saying he's better behind the scenes, in my opinion, and of course, Hui beats poor Jay by almost 100 votes. Moving on to episode 5, Hui follows Wimiti's anti-fragile meme for his intro. again showing his down-to-earth attitude. I mean, in my opinion, anyone who is happy to dance to songs by junior artists and embarrass themselves probably has a decent attitude, considering how intensely hierarchical Korea is. Him doing Anti-Fragile specifically also makes it look like he has literally no shame, which is probably a good thing considering the idol industry. Episode 5 is an elimination episode, so there isn't any particularly exciting editing of anyone, including Hui. But we do see lots of him supporting the other trainees, continuing to acknowledge his faults in dancing, showing leadership skills, and generally seeming like a supportive older brother who doesn't actually want to get involved in all of those dance battle things. In the elimination segment, he seems somewhat nervous and speculates about ranks from the sidelines, so pretty typical survival show behaviour, although I do think he is minimally less nervous than most people, as experienced idols tend to be on these shows. He is again humble, as he doesn't think of himself as being part of the top 9, and he is seen after the eliminations comforting eliminated trainees, which must have been nice for the eliminated people, because imagine one of your literal idols comforting you after you got eliminated. I actually don't know if that would be like mortifying or just nice. I found it both touching and somewhat hilarious when Hui said that it was hard for him to join the show, but that the fans clearly approved. Because on one hand, I feel bad for him that he felt the need to join the show, but on the other hand, duh, of course it was hard for you, and duh, of course your fans would support you. Lol. In episode 6, he's already buddies with Gunnook and Gyuvin, which is cute. Tomboy was an interesting choice for him, but at the same time, of course he was going to do one of the vocal songs. He becomes a part of the Avengers Tomboy team, of course. Tomboy marks the first time that Gunnook and Hui are on the same team, and they ended up being on the same team for 3 of the 4 missions, only not together for the first one. This means you get to hear me talk about how much I love Hui, how much I love Gunnook, and how much I love both of them together. So let's start with Tomboy. Haobin are the protagonists of this one, so both Hui and Gunnook get pushed to the side a little, like I discussed in my Zero Base 1 episode. Hui here is of course the leader and the main vocal, and the fact that the team are nice and friendly and get along well reflects well on him and his delegation skills specifically, as he suggests a part for Junghao after the latter is disappointed about not getting the killing part. The fact that Haobin are the main characters pushes Hui and Gunnook to the side, but you can see both of them often working together in the background of Haobin clips, and they seem to get along well. Gunnook looks up to Hui, and Hui encourages Gunnook. Both are praised for their complete duality on versus off stage, and this shows how much they love being on stage and performing. Their performance is, of course, used as a teaser for the next episode. The team has Hui, the 2 centers, and rank 10 Gunnook, so of course Mnet would use it to make us tune into the next episode. But when they're introduced, Hui hilariously fails his agio, perhaps showing the generational divide between him and the other members. Mnet, of course, also show the group being nervous in evaluations only to be praised. The fact that they happily and confidently announce that they'll sing in the original key is insane. And since Hui is the one who makes all of these announcements, it reflects well on him as an individual. Fun fact, the end of this episode is the 3rd time they've teased a Hui performance to use for clout. Do you think we'll get more? In episode 7, Tomboy team are, of course, the last team to perform, and everyone says they look forward to Hui, as well as the others, of course. He is again shown as a reliable leader. Is anyone even surprised at this point? This is shown through his good delegation skills, him looking after Gunnook, and his ability to reflect well on reasons why they might be ranked 2nd and not 1st in the self-check interims. Interestingly, it looks like both he and Gunnook, by virtue of working together, kind of co-led the team, and both of them provided an incredibly stable base from which Haobin could improve and grow. I genuinely think this stable base they provided is incredibly underrated because it's just so much harder to grow when you're in a dangerous situation, and Gunnock and Hui provided Halbin with a very safe situation. They also had a fun dynamic where Gunnock is over a decade younger than Hui and still towers over him. Hui is yet another tiny leader in K-pop. I wrote in my notes that during this episode, partially because of editing and partially because of how he generally acted, he seemed like a very reliable, skilled, somewhat cool but also very odd uncle. Yeah, that's what I wrote. Anyway, after all of that, who is surprised when the performance is perfect and clean and Hui consistently impresses with his vocals and with his goofy ending fairy? And who was surprised when they won? No one, that's who. In episode 8, we have another elimination episode, but we do get some Hui editing because this is the sorting for the artist round. Hui's weirdness is shown at the start of the episode, yelling that their tension isn't down, whatever that means. This is a great example of how Hui's weirdness is partially his and partially Mnet's editing. He was the one who weirdly yelled, but they were the ones who highlighted the moment, and who randomly pointed out his age, making him look even more out of place on the show. Thus continues the odd uncle vibe. In the eliminations, he has a cute father-son intro with Gunnock and, of course, continues to comfort the other trainees. This episode had a moment that made Hui fans very sad. Hui's rank dropped and he commented to himself his worries. Who would vote for an idol in his 30s? I wouldn't either. This showed both good and bad things. On the bright side, it showed Hui's self-awareness and his awareness of his audience and industry. On the downside, it upset many of his fans, who were concerned that he had internalized K-pop's ageism and was losing confidence because of it. They were also worried that he thought they weren't voting for him because of his age, when in fact, many of them weren't voting for him just because they wanted him to continue in Pentagon. Whether or not it was intended by his fans, I think that his not getting into Zero Base 1 sent the message to Hui that he was too old, and I think that's really sad because, like I said, that wasn't the concern of most fans. And I know that I, and many others, would hate for Hui to stop being an idol just because he thinks that people don't like him just because of his age. This was the first episode where Hui officially dropped out of the top 9, and it understandably confused all of the other trainees, which showed how much he was respected by them, how much faith they had in his fandom to get him in, and the faith that others had in him. Faith that after this he seemed to not have in himself.
연습생은 바로 이회택입니다. 이회택입니다.
진짜로? 많이 떨어졌지.
혜택 형이 10일이라고?
Despite all of this, he gave a nice speech and honoured the fans and his teammates. He was humble and gracious, satisfied with his position and understanding of it. Moving on to something more uplifting, the artist battle where Hui is assigned to On Guard. He volunteers to be the leader again, and we get yet another moment of Hui and the editors unintentionally working together to make him seem goofy. A clip of him rehearsing his leadership application in the bathroom beforehand. This makes him seem very funny and a bit odd, and also potentially points to lowered confidence. But he delivers the speech itself confidently and lists the many things he can do for the team, showing again how reliable and experienced he is. Interestingly, although it made him seem silly, his very considered speech and shilling of his skills to fellow trainees and judges alike, combined with shots of him looking like he's thinking when the requirements for the artist battle are announced, show that he gave a lot of consideration to what was needed for the battle. His speech also showed that he respects the other trainees as equals, and this is compounded by his humble attitude when being made leader. Have you had enough of me talking about how good of a leader he is and how good his attitude was on the show? Well, I hope not, because there's more. He also shows he's good at delegating for positions again, and this time adds a flair for the dramatic, joking with his younger teammates and keeping them comfortable with him as the leader. He's also framed as a reliable vocalist yet again when they do the self-check with other trainees. Now, before we head into the final mission and the final 3 episodes of the show, let's give a quick recap. So far on Boys Planet, Hui has shown himself again and again to be a great leader, and an experienced idol with a great attitude, an eye for performance, and high levels of skill. He's become a reliable figure for the other trainees and has been open, humble, and humorous, giving them advice and generally being a solid presence. Mnet has had an odd duality while editing him. On one hand, they like him as a producer and wouldn't want to alienate him. Both the judges and trainees respect him, and his skills are impossible to hide or deny. On the other hand, they didn't want him in Zero Base 1, so even though Hui's fans decided themselves to not vote him in already, Mnet still wanted to do something to guarantee he didn't make the final lineup. Hence, they edited him very weirdly. They manipulated the situation around him to try and get an emotional reaction, or to edit him badly. They highlight even the smallest of mistakes. They paint him as a depressed grandpa too old and too outdated for the competition, and they act like his dancing, one of the few things which he isn't exceptional at, is terrible when it really isn't. Up until this point, we've seen him be used for views and clout, to promote products and other trainees, and for drama in general, with hints about him failing his demo, his main vocal battle with Jay, and his being pushed to the background in Tomboy. Now we're up to episode 9. So actually this is the final 4 episodes, but ignore that. Where Hui has joined On Guard team and is, as in every other mission, both their leader and their main vocalist. And I do genuinely think Hui showed the depth and breadth of his leadership skills in On Guard, and let's get into why and how. In episode 9, yet again, he and Gunnook seem to be working together as a leadership team for On Guard. I say this because Gunnook was doing a lot of the speaking, which is usually what leaders do. But how much of that was him actually leading versus the staff making him say a script because he was a trainee they wanted to have more screen time is unknown. Hui continues to show a good sense of humour when the recruiting teams come in, and when they run the hidden camera prank on Gunnook. I think the hidden camera prank was a good indication of his leadership skills and experience. He came up with the idea and executed it well. He picked something relatively harmless that would upset Gunnook but not traumatise him or anything, and then he mediated the situation well, giving Gunnook time to himself to take a breather and then ending the prank when Gunnook finally got too depressed, then running to hug and comfort him. It was also a smart way to get more screen time, but goodness knows if the judges planted the idea in Hui's head. Moving on to the family day and the sports day, where the most notable Hui moment is that he falls over himself laughing at Jay catching lollies in his mouth, which just shows again how Hui has a sense of humour and isn't constrained by the older, more experienced, serious idol role some fans would have expected him to take. I thought it was funny seeing him fall over having fun. Anyway, after all of that, they have a silly intro for On Guard team, and Hui's parents are some of the highlighted parents, which I also thought was fun because I don't know if Hui's parents have ever been shown before and I enjoyed seeing them. At this point, we get on to On Guard's performance and backstory, where, in my opinion, Hui's leadership and experience shines through. Perhaps too much for some of his fans. On Guard team are initially going very well, right? So, as a chill leader, Hui lets them get some rest, which is probably a good idea considering how stressful these shows can be. Anyway, they get told off for being late and keeping the staff waiting, which honestly is more of an issue with Mnet making their staff get up super early than it is an issue with On Guard team, who presumably just wanted a bit more sleep. But that's beside the point. The point is, they get told off. A lot. They get told off for being late, they get told off for doing poorly in the interims even though they didn't have to deal with a team reshuffle, and they have talented trainees, and so on. All of this reflects poorly on Hui as the leader, and on the rest of the team, but afterwards when his teammates are joking around like the burly adults they are, he puts his foot down. A few of his fans, as we'll discuss later, felt he was too harsh here, but I personally thought this was a great show of his leadership. He let everyone chill while they were up, but when that didn't work, he reined everyone in. It reflects poorly on them and on him to get told off, and they need to do better, so he becomes more serious, but not to the point of meanness. And he works hard to fix the problem and adapt, showing a good example for his teammates. He looks depressed for a bit after getting told off, reflects on himself afterwards, and uses this reflection and his experience and maturity to pull them back together, specifically by saying he is ashamed of the team, which must have been big for the others to hear coming from him, an experienced idol. He also brings up the eliminated trainees and how they should work to do their old teammates justice, and brings them into a more structured practice schedule. And it worked perfectly, so I don't know what my point is other than that he did a good job. Hence, we get the on-guard grind, and surprisingly, the actual performance? Mnet clearly decided that teasing people with Hui's performances was getting old, and now they wanted to move on to new drama, in this case the Matthew Hanbin leadership shenanigans in Say My Name. So On Guard actually got to perform, and of course everyone loved it. It was good, it was fun, it was far better than the interim, and Hui did a brilliant job with his high note. This did awkwardly mark the second time in the series that there was stress about whether Hui would do the high note well, which is odd since why would he do a bad job based on his track record? And the fact that they did this twice was weird. Mnet highlight the creative choices for the team here, and Hui is shown afterwards comforting them all, which is nice. I did find the judge's comment, "the kids listened well," hilarious, since the one that listened to you the most was Hui, and he definitely isn't a kid. He's probably around the average age of the judges, which is funny to think about. In episode 10, he spends a lot of time with Guven, showing their friendship and Hui's good relationship with others. Of course, everyone wants him for the musical segment, especially since he has musical experience. I found this moment when Gunnock says he'll hold Hui's hand even if he has to cut it off at the wrist funny. Anyway, Hui gets to be cute, be friends with everyone, and be wanted by popular trainees, as a reliable young. As expected, his good vocals and cute acting are highlighted, and his understanding of the story, since, well, he's a producer, experienced, and has done musicals. Of course he'd look at the story and take the musical seriously, even if it's just a small segment. In the end, he is used for product placement and gets the special benefit, neither of which are unexpected, especially since he would be a popular trainee and therefore useful to use for the product placement. When the scores for the artist battle are revealed, On Guard team are of course kept for last, since Hui's fans need to be kept waiting. And then we get to see his determination in this odd segment which seems unsure whether it's trying to be positive or negative about him. Episode 11 is another elimination round, so typical things. Comforting others, being a bit nervous, and speculating. He does have a nice entrance skit with his team where they fence, showing again his penchant for the dramatic and his sense of humour. However, I have one major problem with this. His form is atrocious, and I would know, I coach fencing. This episode is basically elimination Hui, who is humble and helps others, alternating with Sports Day Hui, who is goofy, humble, full of fun reactions, and isn't afraid of embarrassing himself for a good laugh and a good show. He gets a special highlight of being terrible at cooking, which is even more funny when he actually turns out to not be the spy. During the waking up segment with Jaehwan, because I guess that's what I'll call it, it was really funny to see Hui's reaction to being woken up with a song he wrote. And it has the added benefit of highlighting not only his companionship with Jaehwan, but also his brilliant vocals, even after having just woken up. The sadness of Hui being a trainee on a show he used to write for isn't highlighted here, and it is forgettable, but I'm sure many of his fans still thought about it in this segment, as I did. During the actual eliminations, he continues to show what many people would see as decreased confidence, mostly shown through how relieved he seems when he was called. Nonetheless, his speech is nice and rehearsed with the power of 10 years of experience, where he thanks his teammates again as equals and talks about his desire to improve, which I think he's pretty consistently shown over the course of the show. Then we get into the final battle, Hot Summer versus Jelly Pop, where Hui ends up in a funny situation. We probably all know enough about Hui by now to know about his sense of humour and his aforementioned penchant for dramatics. So what better to do to freak out all of his co-trainees than play a mini prank on them, lying to them and saying that the main vocal position is too tiring and hard, and that he'd rather be sub-vocal 1 or 2. This is hilarious because not only is it so obviously not true, but it also really shows how committed to the comedy bit he is, leading up to a great moment where Junghyun begs Hui to kick him out of the main vocal part that he took for himself. For those who didn't see the episode, Junghyun was convinced that if he picked subvocal 1, the part he really wanted, he would be kicked out. So he picked the main vocal part so he could be pushed into the role that he wanted. This was a smart idea, until several people went past and pointedly avoided the main vocal position, even people who were capable of it like Gunnook. Then he started panicking, and having heard that Hui didn't want to do a main vocal part, panicked even more, since really at this point Hui was his only hope. His begging made Hui burst into laughter, something I always like to see, and of course, like I said, Hui was lying, and did in fact want the main vocal part, where he pushed out a delighted Junghyun. Junghyun was so delighted that he called Hui Mr. in the subtitles. As with all great Hui moments on the show, this showed how reliable Hui was, and especially how the other trainees perceived him as reliable. It also shows his great attitude, joking when needed and helping as well when needed. Junghyun is already off to a bad day, but it gets worse because he also decides he wants to be the leader. But his opponent is Hui, and thus he, the audience, and the fellow trainees all decide he is doomed. Which he is. Hui is a nice mix of humble and confident here, thankful that everyone wants him to lead, but confident in his skills as a leader too. Hui's skills in the studio are particularly useful here, and so he shills them, only to get shot down by the others who say that he would help even if he wasn't the leader, which is both funny and true, but it doesn't stop him from getting the leader part anyway. I appreciate how this was the first round where Hui also tried out for the killing part, showing that he was willing to try new things and put himself out there. He didn't get it in the end, and he didn't suit it either, so he shouldn't have got it, but it was still nice to see him try. And to round out the episode, we get some classic Hui awkwardness in dance, and classic Hui analysis of why Matthew got the killing part, showing yet again his knowledge and skills. Wow, you go, Hui. And that brings us to the final episode, finally. There isn't much special editing of Hui here. He's just standing there like the rest of the trainees, and the camera shows him every now and then to fool us into thinking he might be called. Standard survival show finale things. There are only a few segments that are properly edited, so let's look through them now. First is the last words segment, where each of the contestants talks about why they want to be an idol or why they want to keep going on stage. And Hui's segment isn't particularly weird, but it is somewhat unique. Most of the boys talk about their childhood and how they were first inspired to become idols. Some of them do talk about the present and the future, like Gunnook, who says he wants to continue to perform. But even he talks about the past, talking about how successful he was in high school, in comparison to how his confidence took a blow on the show. Hui, on the other hand, is just about loving music, and instead of monologuing to the camera, he sings. He is shown with a keyboard and digital musical files and software, framing him again as a producer and composer, a true musician, and of course as a vocalist. Most of the boys got a little tagline they got to use. Oddly, as a tangent, it seems Gunnook just chose boy. What does that mean? Hui did not get one, which is interesting, but is also probably good because his definitely could not be boy. I followed a podcast over the course of Boys Planet called Gays Planet, where a gay couple discuss what happens on the show. And there is this hilarious quote from the last episode, which I just think is so accurate here.
We humanize them when we needed to humanize them, of like, these are all just 17 boys plus Hui with dreams.
The next edited segment is the interim check and thanking of the judges, which is a segment Mnet seems to have made mandatory because the audience and the trainees must bow down to the judges and do whatever they say no matter what, and they are glorified to the ends of the world. Alright, the only interesting clip from Hui for this segment is more goofiness when he measures his face with his face, and because he's the leader, influences Matthew into doing the same. During the interim, he has a small semi-skit where Junhyun pretends to accuse him of meanly throwing him out of the main vocal part, to which Hui just laughs. Fair. He is also praised endlessly during the interims for his vocals, as expected. During the final letters the judges write to the trainees, they acknowledge how hard it was for him to come on the show, and reaffirm that he's done a good job, inviting him to Soju later, which, 1, shows how they see him as an equal rather than just a trainee, and 2, reinforces how much older than the other trainees he is, since several people in his team wouldn't even be old enough for Soju. Hui seems flattered by all of this, which is nice. In fact, flattered to the point of tears, which I think just showed how many emotions he had associated with the show. The next edited segment is the ads for their performances, during which Camden makes the fatal mistake of suggesting one of them plays a female lead, to which Hui turns right around and tells him to do it, before suggesting more and more ridiculous ideas like him eating jellies off the ground. This is followed by him directing the other trainees to complete the story well, showing his producing skills in a more relaxed light, and considering how brilliant the final film ended up being, I think it went pretty well. During the filming for the killing part, Hui again shows off his vocals, before telling himself off for not dancing and just singing, to which all of the other trainees say it doesn't even matter because he just sounds like a CD, which just shows how vocal-oriented he is, even to the point of subconsciousness, but also how self-reflective he can be. After all of that, Hui, of course, does a great job with the vocals for the performance. I love his voice so much, which was one of the reasons I really loved his album. I'm going to be very sad if he stops making music for himself, which is one of the reasons I'm making this video, to hopefully convert more Hui fans. Moving on, I don't think I need to convince you of my love for Hui. The next edited segment is the behind the scenes of the pajama party, where Hui creates yet another relatively harmless prank, getting Camden to hip thrust on stage while he and Jay walk normally. And then his ability to embarrass himself returns, with Agyo, which I hated, and I think he and the other trainees also hated too. Technically, the subtitles saying that he scared the other trainees could be seen as bad, but considering the light-hearted nature of the segment, it's seen in a more positive light. And no Hui fan will ever complain about him getting more screen time. But the other trainees will give as good as they get, and it's time to turn the tables on Hui, who gets told that his habit of wearing large earmuffs to sleep is off-putting and odd. As a fellow light sleeper, I can relate to him, but he gets torn apart even more when the other trainees say that, despite basically telling others to shut up and be quiet, Hui himself snores loudly. Unfortunate. Most of these clips don't have any particular agenda to them that I can see, but I promised myself I would talk about every notable Hui clip on the show, so here I am, recapping the pajama party. But Mnet have a formula, and their formula is mood swings. Hence, this nice upbeat moment leads into the fan message segment, where one dedicated and angelic fan took the time to explicitly specify to Hui that his age doesn't matter. I hope this fan feels good about themselves because they have the full force of all Hui fans behind them. Anyway, the message was very true. Artistry and success have no age limit. And thankfully, I think this message got through to Hui and touched him at least somewhat. Which, I mean, it was supposed to do, but still, it was an important message to send, and I hope that he will remember it for a long time. Because, and I'll say it again, although it was a factor for a very small minority of people, Hui's age was not what led him to not re-debuting. It was the unfortunate circumstances about how he was marketed and how he marketed himself. Anyway, let's give some claps for this fan and for Hui. The next segment is the final night segment, which also doesn't have a particular agenda, but here we are. In this segment, Hui talks about how Jay made a big impression on him and how he saw Jay as a vocal rival, finding Love Me Right hard to watch back, to which Jay, possibly internally freaking out that an experienced idol is saying something like that to him, instantly says that he wanted to give up when Hui showed up. Which, I mean, if I was a vocalist and I was against Hui, I would also give up. And well, that was it for the rest of the edited stuff. From then on, we had the eliminations where Hui stood around for a long time, obviously, and didn't get picked. He eventually ranked 13th. Clips at the end of the show taken by fans show him hugging and congratulating the members of Zero Base One, especially Gunnock, and comforting the eliminated trainees, as well as talking with the judges as a producer does. As expected. After the end of the show, Hui reportedly talked to several news sites about his experiences on the show, saying that he had been able to learn a lot from the show and from other trainees. He was able to relive his trainee days, see what modern trainees and K-pop was like up close, and just generally grow as a person. He talked about how the decision to go on the show was hard for him, and although he had hard times, how there were also times when he realised how experienced he really was in comparison to others, which presumably made him feel a little more confident. He also talked about ways he can make up his own stage presence considering the stage presence monolith that is 5th Gen. For instance, the mic flip and removing his in-ears during Love Me Right were apparently both stage presence things. Some things that I found interesting were that he apparently picked out both Hanbins as having helped him, Yeram as having instructed him in dance a little bit, and Gyuvin as having been a strong emotional support for him, which I think is wonderful. Gyuvin wasn't shown on the show much and Mnet didn't want him in the group, and many people would say he's less talented than the other Zero Base One members. Yet I will fight anyone who said he didn't deserve to make it in, because not only did his scores throughout the show suggest that his stage presence is surprisingly captivating in person, but also his attitude and personality are just so nice. Gyuvin seems like genuinely one of the nicest people in K-pop. He is consistently thankful for support, kind to others, and does his best to lift the mood. And I think it says something major about Gyuvin if Hui, who was the big person lots of the trainees would go to for support, went to Gyuvin to get his own support. Anyway, applause for Gyuvin, please. The last thing I thought was interesting was that Hui said he wouldn't ask anyone to vote for him in his personal life, so he voted for himself instead and for some of the other trainees. Although he apparently said he voted for several people, the only one explicitly mentioned was Jungwoo. He said that Jungwoo often seemed anxious and that Hui wanted him to be able to showcase himself more, showing not only Hui's producing skills yet again, but also reinforcing how Jungwoo has something really special about him. I think Jungwoo was one of the more underrated losses of Boys Planet. He took the leader position often and was also involved in major rap and killing parts, yet he was rarely recognised for these roles. He even led Hot Summer Team and he was the selfless leader of Over Me who moved to Switch. Jungwoo showed himself time and time again to be an extremely competent leader and performer, and it's a huge shame that he didn't debut with Zero Base One. To think that he was an anxious person behind the scenes when he presented such a stable and powerful aura on the show is, in my opinion, a little bit sad. Luckily for me, and Hui probably agrees with me based on this interview, Jungwoo did get another chance to show himself more, debuting as the leader of OnePact. OnePact haven't gained much attention or success, but they've still released several songs, their most recent comeback being in June of this year, and they are still a group that a lot of people have heard of, especially in the Boys Planet circuit. I unfortunately don't think they'll ever gain mainstream success, but I'm thankful nonetheless that Jongwoo gets the opportunity to continue to show his leadership and performance skills, and hopefully to solidify himself more as a choreographer and a producer in the industry. And that is the end of our recap of Hui's time on Boys Planet. Let's talk about a few archetypes and characteristics that Mnet assigned to Hui and how they created that image for him. Mnet assigned several archetypes and characteristics to Hui over the course of Boys Planet. Now that we've talked about his actual story on the show, let's speedrun the characteristics they assigned to him and what allowed them to do it. Let's start with the negative ones and then take a happier view with some positive ones. First, that he was presented as being like an uncle, a grandpa, or just old in general. They were able to do this because he was the oldest Korean contestant on the show, but it was still a bit weird just how much they managed to create a contrast between him and the other contestants. Let me explain. Hui was the oldest Korean contestant on the show, right? But he wasn't the oldest overall contestant. That title belonged to a Japanese contestant, Ichika, who was 29 turning 30 while the show was shot and aired. Hui also wasn't considerably older than other trainees on the show. Not only was he about the same age as Ichika, but there were others only a few years younger than him. A Chinese trainee, Zhan Hao, was 27, and there were a large number of trainees who were 24 or 25, including Ji Woong, who ended up being Zero Base One's oldest member. Although there is a 5-year gap between being 24 and 29, I don't think the impact on a male idol's chances is particularly different at these ages. I mean, there's tons of male idols in their late 20s and early 30s who are still very popular. SHINee are probably the most well-known example of this, and other groups like BTS, 17, EXO are hitting that milestone as well. But despite all of this, Mnet was still able to make it seem like Hui was so ancient he was on the verge of crumbling into dust. How? Well, there were a few factors. First, the other two eldest trainees were both international trainees, which meant they didn't have to complete mandatory military service. Military service is a very solid and explicit reminder of a male idol's age, and the fact that Hui had completed it, and to our knowledge no one else on the show had, automatically set him apart. He had literally completed life events and milestones the others just hadn't reached yet. Second, the older trainees like Ichika weren't given any screen time, which meant that no attention could be brought to their age the same way it was for Hui. Third, and finally, all of the other trainees Mnet wanted in Zero Base One were, in fact, in K-pop terms, considerably younger than Hui. Ji Woong was 5 years younger, Jung Hao was 7 years younger, Hanbin 8 years, and their desired maknae Yoojin was 13 to 14 years younger than him. The amount of screen time that these desired trainees, especially Yoojin, had, allowed Mnet to highlight the age difference between Hui and their ideal lineup, making him, of course, seem far older by comparison. Also, let's throw in the nice detail that almost all of the other trainees talk about their childhood experience with music in the Last Words segment of the final episode. But Hui noticeably doesn't, and is contrasted in close proximity to people who do mention their childhood, or people like Ganok, who is literally labelled boy. This subtly expresses how Hui's boyhood is further in the past than other trainees, hence making him seem older. Basically, through specific editing/screen time choices, the use of hard age measurements like military service, using his Korean age 30 instead of a slightly less alarming to the audience number 29, and highlighting Hui's 10 years in the industry, a number exaggerated to include trainee days and to make it double digits, Mnet were able to make Hui seem super ancient when he really wasn't. And I really hated how they acted like him being 30, or 29 internationally, made him super old, when that's like only just past being a young adult. He's young enough that he could still be conscripted by most militaries for another 25 years, almost double his age. I don't know why that was the example I thought of, but the point is he's not nearly as old as Mnet says he is, and he's not even old in general, and I hate that he clearly started to think that he was old too. Next, that he is a bad dancer. This is an odd one, because he is a pretty good dancer and is able to keep up with the other trainees on the show, even if his style is understandably 3rd gen, not 5th gen, leaving him somewhat lacking in 5th gen style stage presence. So, having established that Hui is actually a good, or at the very least decent dancer, how did Mnet manage to make him look like a bad one? In a few ways. First, Mnet got very lucky that during the filming of Boys Planet, Hui was also involved in activities with Pentagon, especially the Asian Artist Award performances that we mentioned earlier. This would have meant that Hui would have had less time to practice, and probably would have had to go to multiple different practices, which all would have run around in his head, therefore making it harder to remember things like Here I Am, leading of course to him struggling to learn the song. Combine this with the fact that he seems to learn dances slower than many of the 4th and 5th gen trainees who have had a greater focus on dance, and we can't really blame him for struggling. But Mnet can, and so they highlighted every little mistake he made, and the judges berated him again and again for his dance skills. Additionally, by showing him going to less experienced trainees for help, Mnet could imply that Hui knew less about dance than these trainees, thus highlighting his age through showing how different 3rd gen is from 4th and 5th gen. Mnet had another thing working in their favour: Hui's tendency to focus on his vocals rather than his dance. This makes sense for him. Not only is he, in my opinion, a singer at heart rather than a dancer, but also, no matter how strong he is as a dancer, he will always be a stronger singer. We can see him doing this subconsciously when trying out for the killing part for Jelly Pop. When he wasn't singing, he danced just as well as everyone else, but when he was singing, he just stood there and belted it out. He didn't even seem to realise that he did that until after the performance was over. His tendency to not dance allows Mnet to imply through segments like the demo stage that he avoids it because he's a weak dancer, rather than he just forgets to do it because he's that obsessed with singing. To summarise, through highlighting his mistakes and framing his tendency towards singing as an avoidance of dance, implying to some level uncertainty or fear, Mnet suggests both implicitly and explicitly that Hui is a bad dancer. The power of editing, people! Next, that Hui is depressed or sad in some way. Mnet was mostly able to communicate this idea through manipulating aspects of the show to bring up past emotions for Hui, and then shoving a camera and microphone in his face and highlighting how he was sad at odd times when they had purposefully made him sad. I would say the two main examples of this are the Shine performance and the 101 members coming back. In both of these situations, Mnet engineered what should have been a happy or neutral moment, the introduction of a new mission, and a bright and happy performance by hopeful trainees. But both of these situations were also engineered to remind Hui of how far he had supposedly fallen, as he was now a contestant on a show run by people he had once written for, and with Shine reminding him of Pentagon's lack of success following their initial boom. Unsurprisingly, when presented with these reminders of his fall and when asked to vocally express his opinions about these things, Hui would become sad, or even cried when Shine was performed, and thus Mnet can highlight his sad expression and the other trainees being upset on his behalf and feeling pity for him. This is primarily done through showing confessional after confessional of other trainees, and showing close-up shots of their faces and Hui's face, and occasionally done with sad music as well. This leads to the audience getting the impression that Hui is depressed and pathetic, to the point that those 10 years his junior feel bad for him. Somewhat related to this, we have the idea that Hui is super insecure about his skills, or at least lacks some confidence. This is somewhat related to his patheticness and is shown through, first, him repeatedly asking other trainees for feedback and help throughout the show, and second, him expressing doubt about his skills in relation to other trainees. The first is primarily shown through the signal song mission, where Hui asks a variety of other trainees for help, something that, as I will discuss later and have discussed earlier, shows Hui's amazing and humble attitude, but which was oddly used by Mnet to make him look pathetic and insecure, as he didn't have enough confidence in his abilities to train and succeed without leeching off of other, less experienced trainees. The second way they created this image was mostly through his odd Love Me Right storyline against Jay, where Mnet repeatedly included shots of Hui looking nervous combined with shots of Jay singing to suggest he was worried he would lose to Jay. This makes him seem insecure since it implies that he doesn't think he's good enough to beat a random dude from America, someone who, based on their experience, should by all rights be worse than him. This was further highlighted since Hui created a new and very high note to try and beat Jay, which Mnet implies he wouldn't have done if he was secure in his skills. Now, I don't actually think Hui was insecure about his skills, but again, by highlighting every and any moment where Hui didn't look 100% confident, Mnet can create the opposite impression. Next, that Hui was stubborn. This was an attribute that was only really assigned to him for a small time during Love Me Right. Mnet created this impression by emphasizing how Hui had created a new high note, and how, when the judges said he shouldn't do it, he looked almost mutinous and acted uncertain, like he might just do it anyway. This made him seem stubborn and arrogant to the point of potentially sabotaging the performance, which would obviously be a bad look. This possibility was reinforced by Mnet through teasing Hui's high note again and again, and through showing the judges being worried that Hui would do his ridiculous high note in the actual performance, or would stuff it up in general. Thankfully, he did a good job and did the original high note, but the simple suggestion that there was a possibility that he would stuff it up or do the wrong thing made him momentarily look bad. Now, let's bridge the good and the bad things with something that was pretty neutral. Mnet painting Hui as being weird. This was done through Mnet highlighting everything weird that Hui did, and as many a Hui fan has pointed out, since he is kind of a weird guy with a bit of a weird personality and a weird sense of humour, he was bound to say odd things anyway. So whenever Hui says or does something funny or weird or out of character or out of age, as in doing aegyo, which in my opinion looks extra cringe on his face, Mnet replays these moments again and again, and they provide shots of all of the other trainees giving him funny reactions to make it seem like he's weird or his jokes fell flat. Combined with the fact that every time he does it, they bring attention to his age, and well, you have a recipe for making someone seem like a weirdo. And Mnet were probably delighted that Hui already had a bit of a reputation for being weird, because then he would play right into their editing traps with odd actions and jokes. I say this is a neutral thing because on one hand, it makes him look like an odd uncle, and you don't want an odd uncle in a K-pop group, but on the other hand, K-pop and K-pop fans really like weird idols or crackhead idols, so it kind of balances out. Alright, on to the positive things, most of which weren't edited by Mnet but were just apparent to anyone who had eyes and common sense and could see what Hui was doing. Although some things were included in the editing as the judges and other trainees praised him endlessly. First, that he's an amazing singer. This is something that would have been impossible for Mnet to hide no matter how hard they tried, because they would have to show Hui's performances, right? And there would be no way that Hui would ever not give us a stellar vocal performance, so his skills would always shine through no matter what. But there was one thing Mnet liked about his vocals. They were so good they scared other trainees, and scaring other trainees is good drama. Hence, Mnet often showed shots of Hui singing and the others jumping or looking shocked and awed. Other things they did to show his vocal skills, mind you only when it suited them to showcase it for a storyline of course, such as when emphasizing the Avengers nature of Tomboy Team, include the judges constantly praising him and saying he's above the competition, and giving random technical details about his singing to wow the audience, like emphasizing that he sings with a head voice or in a female range. I barely know what these things mean, and from my admittedly limited knowledge, neither of them automatically make Hui a technically skilled singer, but they sound like hard things to do, especially the way the judges and other trainees say them, So of course it makes the lay audience feel awed at Hui's skills. Basically, the fact that Hui did a great job vocally combined with everyone else constantly saying the same thing, and Mnet occasionally showing it, reinforced his position as a vocal powerhouse on the show. Next, similarly, and all related to each other, that Hui was an experienced idol, producer, and leader. These were more things about him that Mnet couldn't hide no matter what, so they didn't really bother. Hui's leadership skills weren't really commented on, but we did get the impression that the other trainees respected him for it. We saw them coming to ask him for advice, and we saw this respect when he was chosen to lead every single mission he was in. But honestly, this was kind of expected. Similarly, Mnet showed that the other trainees and the producers respected Hui as a producer and a more experienced idol, and appreciated his skills and advice. We saw this in moments when Hui confidently explained how he could help produce for On Guard team, and when the judges mentioned how he had created the Love Me Right team perfectly with the mind of a producer. This was even the arc they took with him over the course of the show. It was one of the ways they advertised him as literally being too good for the show. Since they didn't want him in and couldn't really justify why, they painted him as too old and too good. And yeah, many of his fans did indeed believe he was too good for Zero Base One, which is a fair perspective to take, honestly, considering his skills. Anyway, he was portrayed as being very experienced and skilled, mostly through Mnet showing judge and trainee comments and confessionals, and even if they hadn't shown this, I think we would have got that impression anyway. I firmly believe that one of the reasons lots of other trainees, primarily Yujin, became anxious and upset after being berated by judges but Hui didn't is because he is older and has more experience in the industry. He's been berated so many times that he knows what it's like, and he knows which criticism to take to heart and work on and which criticism to ignore. The fact that he was able to keep his cool throughout the stress of the show and use this emotional free space to improve himself and reflect on his life showed how emotionally mature and experienced he is. This also made him a very reliable rock for the other trainees to improve themselves in relation to. The prime example of this is, as mentioned earlier, Tomboy, where Gunnook and Hui provided a nice and reliable base off which Hao and Hanbin could experiment and improve themselves. If Hao and Hanbin had been in a group where they had to carry the team, they wouldn't have been able to safely experiment to anywhere near the same degree. And that role which Hui and Gunnook took is a role that I think is sorely underestimated and appreciated in survival shows. Ahem, Bora from Girls Planet. Speaking of experience and emotional maturity, the last thing I wanted to discuss is Hui's amazing attitude on the show. As previously mentioned, he used the show as an opportunity to reflect on himself and build his character rather than his skills, since, well, there wasn't much improvement of his skills that he could actually do on a survival show for trainees. Hui showed himself, as I discussed during my recap of his time on the show, to be very humble and to have a great attitude. This was somewhat highlighted by Mnet, but they mostly used it to highlight how Hui was lowering himself by being on the show, or to show how pitiful he was as he had to ask those, quote, beneath him for help. In reality, I don't think anyone thought these things made Hui pitiful. He was very open to feedback from other trainees and from the judges, and he put in effort to improve himself and his skills as much as he could, especially in dance and stage presence. The fact that he took this opportunity to improve and that he specifically chose to work on stage presence and dance shows not only his incredible awareness of himself and what is wanted in the 4th and 5th gen industry, but also showed how skilled he really was. He didn't need to put energy into being baseline competent, which meant he was able to focus on improving his dance, something he was very competent in but which didn't quite match up to his vocal prowess. There are a billion moments I could point to throughout the show where Hui showed himself to be adaptable and humble. When asking others for help, when taking judge and fellow trainee feedback into account, when acknowledging when others were more skilled than him, when asking them to see him as equals, when acknowledging that he might not make it into the group, and so on. He was respectful with other trainees and helped them where possible, while also being aware of his own failings and strengths, and he was very aware of the various reasons why someone might not want to vote for him, showing again and again that the fame and skill of being a pre-existing idol hadn't got to his head. Seriously, I was in awe of Hui's great attitude when watching back his parts on the show. So, TLDW. During Boys Planet, Hui was assigned a number of traits by Mnet, some positive, some negative, some on purpose, and some not so much, some of which were enduring and some of which were only across a short period of time or even just one scene. These included that he was old, a bad dancer, depressed, insecure about his skills, stubborn, weird or odd, an amazing singer, too good for the competition, an experienced idol, producer and leader, was reliable and had a great and humble attitude. Now, since I've been praising Hui for way too long for a mini-sode, hence why it's not a mini-sode anymore, let's move on and quickly discuss why Hui didn't end up making it into Zero Base 1. Make no mistake, Universe definitely had the power to vote Hui into Zero Base 1. He 100% had the manpower behind him to do it, considering how high he initially ranked, how high his audience scores were, how many fans he had in Korea, and how he would have gained fans during the show. I think it needs to be explicitly stated and recognised that Hui didn't make it into Zero Base 1 purely because his fans actively decided to not vote him in. This was such assumed knowledge at the time of the show that one YouTuber whose video I've lost once asked Universe directly, "Universe, you need to decide, will you decide to get him into the group or not? It's up to you." So knowing that Universe decided not to vote Hui in, a very odd choice on survival shows, let's look at the various reasons they may have decided not to vote for him. First, many people felt that he wouldn't suit the concept of the show's final group, since many of the trainees Mnet was pushing, like Hanbin and Yujin, suited a brighter and more upbeat dance concept, while many of Hui's fans felt that he was more suited to darker concepts and ballads, or at least not to the kind of youthful concepts that Hanbin and Yujin embodied. This kind of ended up being true. Many people looking back feel that Hui wouldn't have suited Zero Base 1's concept, especially in Bloom, which I'd agree with, but I do think it would have been fun to see him doing Feel the Pop and Crush. Second, Hui had a group to go back to. This was probably the primary reason he didn't make the final lineup, and him mentioning the ongoing status of Pentagon in the first episode basically secured his lack of re-debut right from the start. Pentagon weren't in as dire of a state as CLC were, and boy group fans tend to be more tightly bound to their groups and want them to continue as a full group as opposed to girl groups. Hence, as soon as Hui even implied that Pentagon could continue as a group, Universe stopped voting for him to ensure that he would return to his group. Universe and Hui, I think, both genuinely thought that Pentagon had a chance. Unfortunately, since a good number of the members left the company and they haven't had a comeback in almost a year, I have very little faith. They did have one comeback after the end of Boys Planet, but I feel like it barely made a splash in the industry, like I even forgot about it making this video, and it definitely wouldn't have saved the group as such. Hui's choice to go on Boys Planet was framed as a selfless choice to save the group, as opposed to CLC's Yujin, whose choice to go on Girls Planet was framed as a last-ditch, self-motivated choice for, well, herself, leading her fans to vote her into the group while Hui's fans wanted him back in Pentagon. Third, his age. Yujin was a big favourite to be the maknae of Zero Base 1, and people felt that a 13-year age gap between him and Hui was a bit much. Kepler's Yujin also had a large age gap with their maknae Yeso, but there were a few reasons this gap wasn't as obvious. First, the age gap between Yujin and Yeso was only around 9 years, while the gap between Hui and Yujin was in the double digits, making it more obvious. Kepler's Eugen also had a more youthful face and mannerisms as opposed to Hui, who seems more mature, and Hui, having done military service, was an ever-present reminder of his explicit age. Hui's age and his age gap with the presumed Maknae was far more obvious than it was for Eugen, and more attention was brought to it, hence one of the reasons that she made the group and he didn't. Fourth, his poor editing from Mnet, which I've discussed, making many people feel that his dance skills weren't up to par with the other members, and avoiding showcasing his skills properly, which made newer fans less likely to see him as essential to the final lineup. Fifth, the idea that he just didn't belong. This was shown through Mnet's editing, as they said he was too old and too skilled for the show, and through the judges and trainees saying similar things. He also stood out in terms of age and maturity and attitude. While other trainees seemed desperate to debut, Hui seemed relatively chill, and seemed to see the show more as an opportunity for personal growth as opposed to being needed for his career. This would have influenced his fans to vote for people who, quote, really needed it. I mean, throughout the whole show, we really just saw that Hui was so insanely overqualified that there wouldn't be much point voting him into the group. Like, Zero Base One have a very nice career set out for them where they'll develop as members, individuals, and as a group, but like, Hui's already at the top. There's only so much more development he can do, and because of that, he just wasn't an interesting character for people to vote in. He's just, like I said, way too overqualified. Sixth and finally is his negative comparison to Kepler's Eugen. Since she had already had the story of being a pretty well-known idol on the Planet 999 show, he was constantly compared to her, and his storyline seemed more stale in comparison. He also compared unfavourably to Eugen in terms of things like explicit and implicit measures of age, and in the presence of his group. Also, the judges on Girls' Planet explicitly said that Eugen wasn't there to get more fame, but this was a statement that was notably absent for Hui. In fact, he himself kind of said that he was there to get more fame, to make his group more famous. This made him seem, to a small extent, more selfish than Eugen, and although it wouldn't have made a major difference in getting him into the group or not, it added on to all of the other reasons. So now that we've discussed the many reasons why his fans might not have voted for him on the show, let's discuss some opinions some of his fans had about his editing. If there is one good thing about my ridiculous Kepler OT8 video, it's that I found out how to use Reddit, and Reddit, despite all of its faults, has been a really useful resource for me when gathering fan opinions for videos. I don't have a large YouTube following, and I don't know how to use Twitter, so Reddit gives me a nice place where K-pop fans of certain varieties are centralized, and where I can, for the most part, easily ask questions if needed for videos. For this video, I was curious how general Boys Planet viewers and Hui fans perceived his editing on the show. Whether they saw it as positive or negative, felt it showed his skills well, and whether it made them more or less likely to vote for him. This is the post I made on the Boys Planet sub, and I got several responses. The general consensus seemed to be that whether or not someone thought his skills were shown, his editing was really weird, and more negative or left out than positive. Commenters pointed out lots of really weird stuff. Him inexplicably being shown as anxious against Jay in Love Me Right, him being portrayed as a poor dancer even though he's definitely not, and so on. Several people mentioned how his performances were always kept to last, and I think this person summed up the perspective of non-Hui fans well. That his age was somewhat of a concern, that they portrayed him weirdly negatively at times, and that even though lots of people wanted him in, they just didn't want him over their picks, and they didn't feel that someone with a relatively high level of K-pop fame needed this extra chance, which, to be fair, is kind of how Hui was portrayed on the show. I think this comment nicely sums up how the attitude towards him was generally positive, but just because it was positive doesn't mean people wanted him to debut. There was this lovely Hui fan who pointed out in detail all of the weird ways Hui was edited, From his introduction on the show as someone who clearly wasn't supposed to make the final group, but who was there for publicity, to his Love Me Right editing, to his weird sad edit with Shine. This person is the one who pointed out to me that Pentagon would have been at the AAAs around the time Boys Planet was filmed, and so Hui would have had less time to practice the signal song, and this is definitely true. So thanks to this person. We all know Mnet's editing is ridiculous, but this just shows it's to the next level. There was also this person who talked about his weird Love Me Right editing and mentioned how he seemed experienced and skilled throughout the show, but that Mnet just kind of ignored him and his skills, especially producing, a lot of the time. I mean, they could have been far more prominently featured than they were. This person also highlights how weird it is that Hui was portrayed like a grandpa, and they also noticed how he was portrayed as just being too different from the other trainees. They also said something that I think sums up the situation nicely. Mnet respected Hui, they just didn't want him in the debut team. Finally, there was this person who interestingly critiqued Hui's leadership style in relation to the trainees who would end up being part of Zero Base 1. A critique which I can understand, but which I disagree with. Mostly because over the course of the show, I think we saw plenty of evidence of Hui switching his leadership style based on the group and situation he was in. But, you know, we all have different perceptions of small video clips, so yeah. I suppose the takeaways from this are that I'm not the only person who thought Hui's editing was really weird, oddly insulting of his abilities and occasionally contradicted itself. Hence why I made this video. Hui was edited weirdly on Boys Planet. He was constantly used to keep viewers watching just a little bit longer. He was used as a base from which other trainees could launch off. Despite his experience and his large fan base, or at least large for a survival show contestant, he didn't make it into Zero Base 1, and for one very odd reason. His fans actively chose not to vote him in. This makes him one of the only, if not the only, survival show contestant to be actively and purposefully not voted into the group, despite having enough fans to make it. Hui's time on Boys Planet was really weird, but that didn't stop his skills from shining through, and it didn't stop him from winning the hearts of many people. He had a great attitude which I think really carried him through the whole experience, and which was definitely the standout point for me. Boys Planet may not have put him or Pentagon back into the spotlight as much as he probably hoped, but it was a great opportunity for him. Networking, learning about 5th Gen, and improving himself as a performer and a character. And I'm glad he took that opportunity. In this episode, I've discussed how he was edited throughout the show, and have discussed the archetypes and storylines he was assigned throughout by Mnet, himself, and the other trainees, but mostly Mnet. I've given some reasons his fans could have chosen to not vote for him, and some thoughts his fans and other Boys Planet viewers had on his editing throughout the show. In the end, we're left with the sad reality of Cube Entertainment, but at the same time we did get the epic mini-album that is Who Is Me out of this, so I'm happy for now, I guess. Really, I just want to hear more of Hui's voice in the future. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. And as I leave, let me wish Hui a very happy birthday, and a very happy, fulfilling and successful career in the future. I'll leave you with my favourite part from his album, Who Is Me, a section that reflects very nicely on what we've discussed today and something that may well reflect Hui's feelings on the matter too. I'm better than before. I'm better than